Hey adventurers, so today's going to be a little bit of a different type of video. It's one that I don't do very often. In fact, I don't think I've ever done this type of video before. Exactly, and I'll mention that again in a second. But the idea here is a subgenre breakdown or explanation, and that is specifically for Christian fantasy. And what is Christian fantasy? I'll have some definitions and then a little bit about my thoughts on what makes good Christian fantasy, and then I will end with some recommendations or some examples of Christian fantasy, and then go through whether I think that they're good examples, bad examples, whatever it might be. But anyways, it's kind of a video that I've been thinking about for a long time, and it's a topic that I know for a fact my thoughts aren't as fully fleshed out in this specific video as I would like them to be. But I want to at least get this conversation started, and maybe in the future I can come back and make a part 2, or I can revise my thoughts as I continue thinking about this. We'll see how it actually ends up working. One of the things that I did in, I guess it was probably 2021 or early 2022, was I did a fantasy subgenre breakdown where I went through a whole bunch of fantasy subgenres and just talked about what they were, what type, or what they meant, what the phrases meant and stuff like that. And so I'm going to take one specific one, that being Christian fantasy, and do that same type of thing here, but in more detail. So Christian fantasy, and Christian fantasy as a whole, it has a little bit of a reputation, and while that stereotype is of course based on some degree of fact, as are all stereotypes, I would like to dispel the notion that Christian fantasy has to be a certain way in order for it to be considered Christian fantasy. Basically, what I'd like to convey is that, as with most topics, there's some nuance to this discussion. So we will start out, what is Christian fantasy? Obviously, this is an important place to start out. We have to know what it is before we can start talking about it. There's several ideas or definitions that I have found, or that I have built based off of what I've seen or heard other people talk about. And so those, I don't know, I didn't number them, I just bullet pointed them. So we'll go through the list, and then I will have my own definition that I have kind of workshopped and created that kind of combines all those ideas together into one a little bit, and we'll see how it goes. So the first definition for Christian fantasy is a very, very broad, and I don't actually think it's completely accurate. And that is fantasy that is written by Christian authors. And the reason why I don't think this is accurate is because some authors who claim to be Christians write books that don't have anything to do with Christianity or anything along those lines. And so I can't say that all fantasy written by Christian authors is Christian fantasy. Let's keep going through the definitions here though. So then we have fantasy written with specific Christian references. This is usually, so this would be things like specifically referencing God or Jesus Christ, or something along those lines. Specific Christian references, biblical references, that's one way of having Christian fiction or Christian fantasy. We then have fantasy that has specific parallels to Christianity, such as retellings. That's one of them. Fantasy that has intentional Christian symbolism. So this would be things like the Chronicles of Narnia, where it may be allegory, or it may not be allegory, but it is very specific Christian symbolism. Aslan the lion dies in order to save the life of not the innocent, the person who rebelled, the traitor. That's how he's referred to. So very, very specific Christian symbolism in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I don't like giving the examples. I'm going to stop with the examples until we get down to that part of the story. The next definition is fantasy where God exists as himself. This is harder to describe and harder to come up with specific examples for. I have one in my mind, but I don't really want to use it at the moment. I don't want to talk about examples at this specific moment. And then the last one that I've kind of found is fantasy that promotes biblical values, whether God is present or not. This is kind of the majority of Christian fantasy, where there may be a God or there may not be a God, but these Christian values, these Christian themes, these Christian ideas are so heavily presented through the source, through the material that you're reading, that it's obvious that they are biblical values. Of course, all of these other ones also include it is fantasy that is also written by Christian authors. That's kind of a prerequisite to fantasy, to Christian fantasy, is that it be written by a Christian author, but at the same time, all Christian fantasy is written by Christian authors. Not all works that Christian authors write are necessarily Christian fantasy or Christian fiction. Alright, so that was probably more convoluted than it needed to be, but my own definition kind of takes from all of these and becomes both a bit more broad and generic, as well as in some ways refines this genre. And so I like my definition, obviously, because I came up with it. And my definition here is fantasy that is heavily based off of and oftentimes has strong allegorical biblical themes. Not always. They don't always. That's why I say and oftentimes has. But it is heavily based off of biblical themes, biblical concepts, values, whatever it might be. That's kind of the idea that I think of when I am approaching whether a book is Christian fantasy. Or oftentimes Christian fantasy goes hand in hand with clean fantasy, which is another subgenre, or noble bright fantasy. My friend Tori from the channel Tori Talks has a really good video on this that I'm going to send you to go watch, because she talks about clean fantasy and gives some recommendations, and I think it's a really good video, probably significantly better than this video is going to be, and that's fine, but I do recommend going and watching that if you're unsure what clean or noble bright fantasy is, what those terms are. So now we get into what is good Christian fantasy is, and this is, again, another part of this topic. It's one that undoubtedly my own opinions differ from many others on what is good, especially since opinions are subjective. I think that there are some precepts that should be followed and found in all Christian fantasy, but at the same time, I don't think that there is a correct way to create Christian fantasy. As a little bit of an aside, Tolkien has an essay titled On Fairy Stories, where he talks about fairy stories and what makes fairy stories and how you classify fairy stories and all that kind of stuff. It's a great essay. I recommend reading the whole thing, but specifically there's one point in it where he talks about subcreation. And that idea ties a lot into, and actually fed a lot of my own thoughts as I was working on this video here. So I recommend going and reading his On Fairy Stories if you haven't already, because the topic of subcreation is one that I find very interesting and that I think applies to this conversation as well. But rather than rehash that, go read it from the master himself, because Tolkien is far better wordsmith than I will ever be. Alright, so back to this script here that I have though. Some people would surely only classify Christian fantasy as good if it was blatant, obvious, and in your face about the Christianisms, as I'm going to call them here. Meaning it's preaching at you because you are a bad person, you need to get saved type thing. And while some of this can be good, I find that the most effective stories are those that put the story first and are not preaching at you. That type of story has its place, but it will never get the readership that it desires, and it will never get the readership of the general reading audience, because people don't want to read that. They want to read a story. My opinion of what makes it good is when you can read the story and enjoy it, no matter if you're a Christian or not. You should be able to impart truths through your story without forcing opinions on people. As a bit of an aside, this is my biggest problem with both Hollywood and the Christian film industry today. The majority of the time, they are both pushing agendas one way or the other, and neither of them are putting story ahead of their agenda. There's exceptions. Of course there's exceptions. There's exceptions all over the place. There always are. I'm not going to follow down that rabbit hole any farther, but I just want to say that is my biggest issue with film and television these days, is they don't tell a story first. Back on track though, you should always be able to find how a fantasy book is Christian fantasy if you're looking for it. But also, if you're not, it should be subtle enough that you can enjoy the story itself for what it is. And now I want to go through a few examples of things that are and aren't Christian fantasy. I am going to try and clarify some of my thoughts here. I feel like they're a little messy, and so I want to go through here and try again to finish this part up a little bit more clearly. So, These are the examples of things that are or aren't Christian fantasy, or what I would consider, would or would not consider Christian fantasy, and maybe a little bit about if they're a good or bad example of them. We'll start with the big ones, and then we'll do some smaller examples, mostly self-published examples towards the end. But the big ones, John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. This is literally an allegory for the life of a Christian. And I haven't read this one. I know some of the story, I know most of the story, I would guess, but I haven't actually read it, so I can't really comment on whether or not it's how good of an example it is of Christian fantasy. I do know that it is very explicitly Christian fantasy, and that's maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing, depending on who you are, but I would need to read this book before I could actually comment on what I think of the book itself as Christian fantasy, but I do definitely consider it Christian fantasy. And then there's The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. These are also obviously Christian fantasy, but they're also very story focused. If you wanted to read them and not try and get any Christian allegory or symbolism or anything out of them, you could. You could just read them for the stories and enjoy them for the stories and what they are. But at the same time, they very much are Christian fantasy, and I would say they're a fairly good example of what Christian fantasy can be. Not as good as this next example, which is Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings specifically. Tolkien was a devout Catholic. Lord of the Rings is very story focused, and there's Christian themes layered throughout it, but he himself said that it's a Christian or a Catholic work. And what he's getting at with that is he was so Catholic that it went into his works, and you can't escape it. You can't escape who you are when you're writing a book. You can try and write so that it's not pushing an agenda or something like that, and that's great. But there will always be some aspect, some level of who you are that's in that book. And I think that's appropriate, I think that's proper. And with Lord of the Rings, if you're looking for them, you can definitely see the Christian themes, the biblical themes scattered throughout this story. Sanderson is a Mormon. It doesn't matter what other Christians consider Mormons to be, but Mormons themselves do consider themselves to be Christians. And so I would say that although Sanderson, as a Mormon, considers himself to be a Christian, I wouldn't actually say that his books are particularly Christian. They're clean fantasy, sure, but they aren't really Christian fantasy in that same way. There's a difference even between that and Tolkien, where Tolkien wasn't specifically trying to write a Christian or Catholic allegory or anything like that. But Sanderson, his books don't even feel like that. They're good, they're clean books. I don't have a whole lot of problems with the way that he writes his books. I have my own issues with his books, but I don't consider his books to be Christian fantasy. And I don't consider his books to be Christian fantasy, even if you can occasionally find some Christian themes, some biblical themes spread throughout them. They're there for sure, but it's very hard to escape them, and that's okay. I wouldn't consider them Christian fantasy, and that they're just a good example of clean fantasy for the most part is what I would put them as more than anything else. Then we have Rowling, J.K. Rowling with the Harry Potter series. She claims to be a Christian. The books definitely have some Christian elements and themes, especially later in the stories. It starts to come out a little bit more. But for the most part, it's just a story, and although those Christian themes can be found, I would not consider those books to be Christian fantasy either. They're not anti-Christian. That's not what they feel like at all. But I wouldn't consider them to be Christian fantasy in that same way. If you do, that's fine. I'm not gonna say no to that. But they don't really feel like Christian fantasy to me. Just good fantasy stories. Then we'll get into some smaller examples here. Oh, I missed one. Brent Weeks with Lightbringer. Brent Weeks claims to be a Christian, and in some ways, especially in book 1, I could definitely see that. It definitely felt clean for the most part. There was some dirtiness, griminess to the world, but it was not blatant, it was not graphic, and it was just, for the most part, a story with some actual Christian themes threaded into the story that he was telling. Books 2 and 3, I wouldn't quite say as much along those lines, but I've heard that towards book 5 he starts getting back to a little bit cleaner of a story and a little bit more Christianity influencing the story. I don't know, I haven't read book 4 or 5 yet, but so kind of partly with him. I wouldn't really consider his books Christian fantasy though. even though the first book does in a lot of ways feel more Christian fantasy than some, especially in books 2 and 3. Now onto the smaller examples. Enclave Publishing. Enclave Publishing does Christian fantasy, or Christian sci-fi and fantasy, Christian stories, and they're very much Christian fantasy, Christian sci-fi, and there's nothing wrong with that. Some are definitely more blatant, more preachy than others in that they've published though. Andrew Peterson with the Wingfeather Saga. This is a very story-focused series, but it's also very Christian. It's clearly Christian. It's not preachy though, but it is clearly very Christian. Lots of biblical themes and Christian elements and stuff that are tied into this story. I would actually, this is one of the best examples of Christian fantasy that I have ever read. Best examples of not what the genre could be, but or what the genre is most of the time, but rather how to tell a great story while at the same time telling a Christian story. It's kind of like Narnia in that way, except maybe better than Narnia. Andrew D. Meredith with the Collation Saga. This is one that I absolutely think is Christian fantasy, and again, like with Wingfeather Saga, it's also very story focused. It's, if you are looking for those Christian themes, they're there, very much so. And I would absolutely, reading those books, I was like, yes, this is Christian fantasy 100%. But you can also just read the stories and enjoy the stories, and they're great stories, and you'll still pick up those themes. But if you're not specifically looking for them in the lens, through the lens of Christian fantasy, they're just great stories. So that's what I want to leave with that one. Dawn of Wonder by Jonathan Renshaw, another book that I've proclaimed endlessly about on the channel. Great book. At least I love the book. Another very much a Christian fantasy if you're looking for it, but it is, again, it's a story first. The story is the main focus of this book, and the character's journey is the main focus of this book, and those biblical aspects, those Christian aspects do come out, but they're not blatant, they're not preachy, and neither is Meredith with Collation Saga. The last one that I have on the list is Phased by Tori Tekken. This is mostly just a good story with some Christian elements woven in, but this isn't really one that I would consider Christian fantasy, although it is clean. I think it's clean. I don't remember anything bad in it, but it's just a good story with some Christian elements in it, but largely I wouldn't consider it Christian fantasy in that same way. Anyways, I wanted to hopefully make that a little bit more streamlined than the original attempt going through these was, so I will send you back there now. Right. All of these, this whole video is kind of a little bit about, this is the subgenre. Here are some examples of the books, and here are some that aren't as good of examples because they're more stereotypical. I don't actually have a ton of the more stereotypical examples because I haven't read them, because I tend to not enjoy being preached at either, even though I am a Christian. So that's really all that I wanted to do with this video. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We're posting videos every Monday and Thursday, and we'll see you guys again soon. Stay warm.